So good morning, my name is Dermot Bresson. I'm the Mary McAleese Chair in Connected Leadership here at Queen's University. And welcome to our Business Breakfast Insights. This is the third in the series. Today we're going to focus on balancing people and performance. Welcome also to the Clinton Institute. So the Clinton Institute is part of Queen's Business School. We are focusing on lifelong learning and also engagement with business, and that's what this session this morning is about. It's about engaging with business and connecting the research we do and all of you very kindly to come along this morning. So the format is going to be that I'm going to pass over to one of my colleagues who's going to talk about her research, very interesting research project. And then we have three invited guests that are part of our panel. They're going to discuss some of the issues from that. And then we're going to open it up to you for a brief session and then wrap it up at the end. So our keynote speaker is Dr. Juliet Hassard. Juliet is a reader here in the school. Her research focuses on designing and developing approaches for a psychologically safe and healthy work environment. And Juliet is going to present this morning her value-based leader framework. Very interesting research. And then we're going to have a discussion from our three panelists. So our first of our speakers is Brendan Mooney. Brendan is the CEO of Kainos. And over the 2 decades he's been with them, they've won a number of awards, including the Sunday Times 100 Companies to Work For, the Great Place to Work Award, and also the first in Northern Ireland to get the Disability Competent Leader Award. Our second speaker is Caroline van der Feltz. Caroline is the HR director of Danske Bank. She's worked in the sector of finance and fast-moving consumer goods sector for considerable time. And under her leadership, Danske Bank has won the, let me just get this right, the Gold Diversity Mark Award and also a world-class employer, recognized as a world-class employer. And our final speaker is one of our MBA students, Conor O'Rourke. Conor is the founder of Root and Rise, which is a consultancy looking at developing and promoting well-being, leadership and growth in organizations. Conor's organization uses a human-centered approach to encourage and to promote individuals both professionally and encourage them to thrive professionally and personally. So I hope you enjoy this morning's session, and I pass over to Juliet. Thank you.
Brilliant. Welcome and a very good morning to everyone. I'll maybe start just by introducing myself. I'm Dr. Juliet Hassard. My background is as an occupational health psychologist. So my research, has been sort of very kindly highlighted, is really at the epicenter in terms of exploring how we design workplaces, how we think about, we manage and develop people within that sort of space. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about a project that we've just concluded at the end of last month. Really that has looked at and tried to better understand the interface between employee mental health and well-being and productivity. But before I sort of dive in to give you, I hope, an interesting overview of the emerging findings and where we're hoping to go next, I wanted to start my talk by situating the discussion first and foremost in why mental health. So why is it important for us to explore and consider employee mental health and well-being? So just a couple of figures here in 2022, 23, almost 900,000 workers suffered with work-related stress, depression, and anxiety. So this equates to approximately just over 17 million working days lost. If you look at the general trend, I think what we can see quite dramatically in those sort of latter points right in the end is that kind of COVID period. So not only can we see a very general trend upwards, but this has been a very significant sort of jump up in terms of stress, depression, and anxiety. What we know in terms of that general trend is that hasn't come down significantly. So we're still in a period of very elevated levels of stress, depression, and anxiety within the working population. And I'm sure for many of us, I can say for myself, it really resonates coming out of that time period, which was stressful to say the least, but with that a huge amount of very rapid and accelerated change. So if we look at the scale, we can see that this is a very significant and unfortunately continually high level of poor mental health within the working population. But if we switch the focus to why is this a relevant and important issue for employers? Now, typically within the mental health research space, we've often sort of talked about three broad pillars in terms of why it's important for us to consider and manage these issues. First and foremost, of course, we can talk about legal frameworks within the UK, where we can see the importance and necessity of identifying and managing risks within the workplace, and that relates to mental health as much as it does the physical risks within the workplace. We can talk about the wider arguments, and I think there's importance in that in terms of the sort of CSR arguments that it's important to invest in people, it's the right thing to do, it's the ethical thing to do. But the third important pillar from my perspective is what's the business case? And so if we look at some of the emerging figures from Deloitte, we can see that the estimated cost of poor mental health at work is about 51 billion per year. And that broadly equates to three key cost components. So the first are probably the ones that we typically think of as sickness, absence, and turnover. But what I think of is really the hidden cost to poor mental health at work is presenteeism. So this is coming to work not feeling well, but working at a reduced productivity capacity. Very difficult to spot, but is, when we look at the cost, the most significant cost from an employer perspective. So about 24 billion of that 51 is just to do with presenteeism. We know about 40% of the total turnover costs are now attributable to mental health challenges and issues in the workplace. So while we can see, I think that's a huge amount of money from an organizational perspective and from an employer perspective, what I really also wanted to highlight is that while these are three important and significant costs to employers, there's also a wide spectrum of costs not being accounted for here. And we can talk about reduced quality of life. We can talk about the wider sort of recruitment costs with bringing in new staff, etc. So it's a huge amount of money, and I suspect it's likely an underestimate of what the true scaling cost is. So in some ways, in terms of today's discussion, sort of centers on why leadership. Why is this important? Leadership capability and culture directly influence mental health and performance. We know this. Line managers are at the forefront. They're often the first ones to see some of the early warning signs in those that they manage. And with that can be a really important linchpin in terms of opening conversations, talking about reasonable adjustments. But from a leadership perspective, this is a really important leverage in terms of how we shift organizational culture around mental health and well-being. And ultimately, we have individuals who are there making day-to-day decisions, both strategically, but also in their day-to-day leadership practice that have a really important and direct influence, both in terms of culture and climate, but also in terms of employee mental health and well-being. So ultimately, we know that when we get it wrong, this has implications in terms of lost productivity, but also in terms of employee mental health, well-being. Of course, we can talk about motivation, job engagement, job satisfaction. But I think what's important, and I hope where we're central some of our discussion today, is what happens when we get it right. So what is the strategic value from an organization perspective in investing not just in mental health and well-being, but also in the skill development and learning and growth within our leaders to formulate cultures that are much more people-centered and underpinned by mental health and well-being. So I'm going to sort of start by, I hope, giving a bit of an overview of some of the emerging findings from this wider piece of work. So to give a little bit of an introduction to the research project, we were awarded 1.7 million from the ESRC to explore the link between mental health and well-being and productivity. And this was a wonderful collaboration, both with ourselves here at Queen's, but also with colleagues at University College Cork, Warwick Business School, the University of Nottingham, and Lancaster University. So a wonderful multidisciplinary team, but also a multi-institutional research project. And we went on a journey for about 3 years to sort of explore this, looking at a variety of different methods and approaches. So as part of this wider project, we conducted an annual enterprise survey exploring productivity, but also exploring from an enterprise perspective, mental health and well-being initiatives, approaches, and so on. So what we were able to do with this wider body of research is to look at it collectively and start to ask some really interesting questions. So in the context of this series of studies that I want to present to you, we wanted to understand whether there was a link between organizations that offered line manager training in mental health and improved productivity in comparison to enterprises that didn't offer this type of well-being initiative. Over the course of 3 studies, we found pretty compelling evidence. So the first study asked some pretty basic questions. Do we see an improvement in recruitment, retention, service ratings, and reduced long-term absence? And the answer to that is absolutely, we do. So for organizations that are investing in and providing line managers with the training and the skill development around what is mental health, how do I have conversations around mental health, how do I begin to explore reasonable adjustments, we see improved productivity indicators in these enterprises. We then extended that to say, well, what about presenteeism? We know it's one of the most significant costs in terms of poor mental health. Is this an important initiative in terms of reducing that wider challenge? And again, the answer is compelling. Absolutely. In organizations that offer this type of initiative, we see reduced presenteeism. Interestingly, we also see in these organizations, they're more likely to offer a wider spectrum of mental health and well-being initiatives. So this isn't just a one-off strategy. This is part of a wider portfolio in terms of inclusion, in terms of mental health and well-being, et cetera. So it's important to recognize the value of this type of initiative and intervention, but it's really being situated within a much more proactive approach within this organization. The third study started to look at to try to better understand what are the characteristics of these types of organizations. What sectors are they in, et cetera? Where are their key challenges? And we found a variety of things, but for the purposes of today, what I really wanted to highlight, because I think within the context of Northern Ireland, it's particularly important, is that SMEs are less likely to offer this type of training. And in many ways, I don't think that's a huge surprise. Many of these initiatives might come with sort of access and resource costs, and that becomes quite challenging for organizations that perhaps don't have the same level and resource as compared to larger organizations. So I think what we can really deduce from this series of studies is that investing in skill development within line managers around mental health and well-being isn't just the right thing to do, but ultimately is a strategic thing to do in terms of exploring and investing in productivity and performance. So I think that gives us a pretty useful picture thinking about line managers. But ultimately, if we explore organizations, line managers are part of a wider ecosystem in terms of management and leadership within organizations. And so from that, we really wanted to extend this to start to ask questions around culture and climate, and really starting to explore senior management values. How does this drive and influence not just the climate that we're in terms of mental health and well-being, but ultimately how that relates to productivity and performance? So conceptually, we situated ourselves in something called psychosocial safety climate. So this refers to employees' shared perceptions of the policies, practices, and procedures in place to protect and promote psychological health and safety. So ultimately, it's shaped by senior management's values, beliefs, and practices. And it has 4 key dimensions to it. So we first look at organizational participation. So how involved are organizations in terms of engaging employees in discussions around mental health and well-being? To what degree do management and senior leaders demonstrate commitment to mental health and well-being? How much do they prioritize this, both in terms of it from a, let's say, an inclusion perspective, but also as a strategic initiative? And the third component in terms of looking at how organizations communicate and create channels for feedback and discussion regarding mental health and well-being. So this gave us a really useful climate indicator of organizations to get a sense of, I'm going to call it their corporate climate in mental health and well-being. So we wanted to start our sort of reflections on, again, starting to ask some questions about, do we have evidence to tell us that there is a link between this climate, this corporate climate in mental health and well-being, strongly shaped and defined by senior management values, beliefs, and attitudes, and productivity. So we started by doing a review of the literature. Again, not particularly surprising, we found compelling evidence to see in organizations that have a high PSC, or a high corporate climate in mental health and well-being, we find evidence of lower turnover, higher performance, reduced absenteeism, reduced presenteeism. So a pretty compelling case. If you're interested, we have this as a state-of-the-art review published with the Enterprise Research Center. But what we wanted to do was to extend that. So we wanted to then ask the question of what happens when we begin to synthesize this data statistically. So we used a meta-analysis approach. We had 15 studies, which when we grouped them all together, worked out to about just over 16,000 workers to start to ask some of these questions, not just in terms of qualitatively, but to start to test that through a kind of a quantitative approach. Again, we see a very compelling argument that we see a strong and notable link between mental, psychosocial safety climate and productivity, improved productivity indicators. So really, we can start to see quite an important emerging picture here, that we can see that senior management values, beliefs, and attitudes that are shaping and shifting organizational culture are incredibly important, that this relates to working conditions and job quality. And ultimately, at the kind of end of that sort of process, we see improvements, not just in terms of mental health and well-being. And there's lots of evidence now that shows us the link between this corporate climate and mental health and improved occupational health and safety outcomes. So not just mental health, but lots of other fantastic and important health and safety outcomes. But what's really important is we're extending that picture. We're developing it to the productivity and performance space, to sort of extend from both saying this is important, not just from a health and safety perspective, but also from a business and strategic perspective. So with that, we went on a bit of a journey. For us, the picture seemed quite clear that psychosocial safety climate, senior management values are really quite important in terms of from a mental health perspective, but also from a productivity perspective. But the essence of that was, well, what are those values? And how can we understand that, let's call it typology of values, in order to think about how we can improve them and embed them both in terms of leaders' development, learning, and skill profile, but also to extend that in terms of how we could utilize those in a very targeted way to improve culture and climate within organizations, which from our perspective, we would argue is not only beneficial from a mental health and well-being perspective, but from our emerging evidence, a strategic business imperative. So we went on, as I can say, a bit of a journey, about a 2-year journey. We started by conducting employee surveys in both the UK and in the Republic of Ireland. So we onboarded about 35 organizations. We did surveys within their employees across the whole organization. And what was really useful is that we had a measure in there that allowed us to look at their corporate climate. So using that and using established benchmark procedures, we were able to say, look, these group of organizations are really fantastic. They're doing something really fantastic as observed by their employees. And this is going to be our best practice case study collection. So it's 17 organizations in the UK and Ireland that demonstrated this kind of really fantastic corporate climate. We then went and did a number of interviews within those organizations, their leaders, their managers, and effectively said, look, what's in the secret sauce? What are you doing that is so fantastic and that your employees are really resonating with? And that's demonstrating in those indicators in terms of health and well-being. From that, we could see there was a very clear value framework that was emerging. So there was a real sense of purpose and value structure within these organizations. So that started us on the journey of the support framework. But that felt that wasn't quite enough. We wanted to go back to the organizations once we had identified these values, said, look, what do you think? Have we got it wrong? Is there something missing here? Went back, we further refined it. We went then and did a series of industry consultation, again, with the view saying, look, have we got it wrong? Does this resonate with you? We then ended that process then by going to a panel of international experts in mental health and well-being to really sort of try to validate from a theory and an evidence-based perspective in terms of our final set. of values. And this is where we got to at the end of that 2-year process. So the support business values framework has 7 key values within it. Safety, so psychological safety, where people feel safe to speak up. Understanding, so compassionate listening and shared empathy. People-centered, so co-designed inclusion and amplifying employee voice. Protect and promote, so proactive work design, coping strategies, and remedial supports. Openness, two-way communication, transparency, and dialogue. Rest and recovery, so understanding boundaries, sustainable rhythms, ensuring rest and recovery, center at what we do. And final, trust and transparency, so fairness, clarity, and consistent follow-through. I'll just give you a little snapshot. So the broader framework includes both the value, we have a definition for it, we have a guiding principle for it. We also, some feedback from industry was around value-based affirmations to sort of synthesize that into what is it we're really trying to achieve, and then trying to give some practical examples of what that might look like at multiple levels within the organization. So from an employee perspective, how do I embed and enact that value, to thinking about that at the team level, the leader level, and arguably the organizational and governance level. What I think is, and this is where I want to sort of end my talk, is what's really exciting is we're now embarking on the next phase of this project, where we're starting to design a leadership development training package that is underpinned by this business values framework. So it's digital, it can be completed in leaders in their own time. So it's online content, it's multimedia, and it really focuses on developing a SMART goal at the end of each one of these micro learning units. So each of the values has its own 20, 30 minute sort of resource-based training package. It's free and accessible for organizations, and we felt that was really important, partly to make sure that we can make it available to, particularly to SMEs that may have limited resource in this space. It being self-paced felt very important, so for leaders can dive in and out when it's convenient, when there's time allowing. It's resource adaptable. It's flexible. And I think what was really important for us as well is that it had both a digital interface, but also an associated workbook. So for leaders who wanted to dive in more into their reflections and developing an action plan around their day-to-day leadership practice, that would become a useful and flexible tool. I'll end there. The final sort of pitch, if you will, is we've got some printouts of the support framework that gives you that overall framework in terms of the guide, the principle, as well as we have some printed materials there from the training package itself. So we are in a process now where we're about to sort of roll it out, and we'd really welcome any organizations or leaders that are interested to give it a go, to have a flip through, to work through it. We'd be very keen to get your reflections and to see if that's something that would be useful for your organization. So with that, I'd like to welcome the panel members to the stage, and we can dive more into thinking about that tension and considerations around that performance pendulum. So please. Brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us today. Oh, let me just get my questions here. So Brendan, maybe if I can start with you, if that's okay. So as a CEO of an international technology PLC operating in a context described as mainly or is highly volatile and unpredictable, how do you personally navigate the tension between driving business performance and the upholding of Kainos values that have served to develop such a successful business and a positive work culture?
So, Juliet, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. You unpacked a lot of detail very quickly, so the rest of us will probably catch up parsing it later, but absolutely fabulous. And thank you for having me here today. To me, I think the starting point is that kind of performance and values are aligned, not competitive. I think that for us as an organization, we succeed because great people choose to join us, to work in a motivated fashion and stay with us for a long period of time. So we're quite clear about how those things fit together. So we do our global induction every 2 weeks. One of the first sessions is an opportunity for me to chat to people who are joining and to thank them for joining Kainos, but also to make it clear that for us, we have 3 priorities as an organization. So the first one is so they're all important to us, but the very first one is about how we need to be a great employer. So if we want great people to join and stay and give their labor to us, then we have to create an environment where they feel valued. And so that's kind of priority number 1. Number 2 is about how we support our customers achieve their business objectives, because ultimately we are paid to help them achieve their objectives. That's kind of super important as well. And then the third are a number of measures. So we are a growth-oriented company. So for people developing their career, to be in an organization that is growing is very helpful for us to create that kind of sense of opportunity for them. But we also want to be independent. So, being profitable is a key part as well. And then we have commitments around how we reduce our climate impact and how we contribute to the various communities. So we're kind of super clear about that framework. So they're all really important to us, but number 1 is about our people, number 2 is about our customers, and then number 3 is about how we perform financially as an organization. And I think that because they're designed in that way, they work well for us. So we, Dermot mentioned those kind of various awards that we've received around our workplace culture. If we look at kind of staff turnover, we're at kind of 7% attrition, which for a technology company is probably kind of best in class. We look at our engagement scores, where we every month we ask our colleagues how we're doing, and they give feedback about what they think we're doing well and where we could improve as part of that. And then obviously as a business, we're performing strongly in terms of both growth and our performance around profit.
Brilliant. Can I ask a follow-up question to that? I think you mentioned alignment, that alignment between sort of values and the kind of day-to-day sort of business practices. And I'm wondering, in that sort of journey, has there been challenges in finding that congruence between, who you are as an organization and how that translates into day-to-day? Or have you found anything that has worked particularly well in terms of finding that congruence and alignment?
Gosh, right. I think that because we set our priorities out very clearly, and they're actually very simple to follow. I mean, it's something we repeat a lot. It peppers lots of our communication, and I think that there's always tension between those different groups. To me, if I use kind of COVID as an example, I know we try and forget that, but back to March of 2020, and for us, if I think about how we were reacting to that crisis, then all of our activity in the first kind of few days was about how do we get our people to somewhere safe. So if they're traveling, how do we get them back home? If they're in the office, how do we get them back into their house? So that was a whole bunch of activity, and because we're a technology company, that's probably was quite easy to do. We have the infrastructure there. Then as that became apparent, we were succeeding in that. Then how do we support our customers who were going through some challenges, and some of our customers, the likes of say the NHS, people do not have laptops. So we were shipping all the laptops to some of our customers so they could do kind of work from home and support them there. And the third thing was, how do we think about how we protect the financial status of the company as well. So what can we do about reducing costs? What can we do about giving ourselves certainty about the future? So that was like kind of, there was lots of tensions in that. But that was how that framework helped us guide our thought process around how we should react and how we should set our priorities.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Caroline, can I ask a question? So Danske Bank has been recognized as a world-class employer and a leader in diversity and inclusion. How do you ensure that purpose and people remain central to business strategy, especially in a sector often driven by performance metrics and regulatory pressures?
No, absolutely. And thank you for having us here to talk about the Danske Bank story as well. I think the other piece around regulatory and commercial would be technology as well. And I think that's an important factor as people in the workplace settle in and actually can thrive in their chosen pursuit of a career. For us, being the biggest bank in Northern Ireland, we have a huge sort of systemic responsibility as well, not just to our colleagues and to our customers, but to society. And I think that sense of purpose and connection runs through the culture of the organisation. So diversity and inclusion for us isn't an end in itself. It's just a method by which we reach out, understand our colleagues' stories, understand what makes them thrive and perform well at work, and then look very much to layer on top our support. I think if we look at the workplace, people are working longer now. We certainly have people that work way beyond retirement age, and it's really important in terms of their purpose and why they're working. We understand that and we value that. And I think if you look at the average age of some of our colleagues, we have a really broad spectrum for up to some of the departments of 4 generations in one department. If I think about our operations structure, and that's a really difficult continuum for leaders and managers to manage. But I think what we've done is start to pull out some of those stories. So connecting the commercial performance and what they're delivering to their journeys and their unique sort of characteristics and what they bring to the personality of the organisation. There's a really interesting study done by the IMS, which is Growth in an Aging World, and that came out earlier on this year. And I think what was really interesting for us is how do you value even the older worker in terms of performance and potential, and what do they contribute to the organisation. And what that study found was that 70-year-olds in the workplace today have got the same cognitive capability as a 50-year-old in 2020. Sorry, in the year 2000. So it's really outstanding when you kind of think about the contribution there as well. So I think it's very much about understanding and valuing what our colleagues are contributing, measuring that. We actually have done extensive work in understanding what our diversity makeup is, as well as the external accreditation, which, let's be honest, it builds some confidence. It helps us understand how well we're doing in what is a relatively small market in Northern Ireland. But actually, what our data gathering exercise, Who We Are, did was bring a lot of that to life. So we had 80% of our colleagues told us everything from their sexuality to their caring responsibilities, and that's enabled us to build a policy architecture throughout that.
Brilliant. It's so interesting, I think, to hear both the importance but also the value of that sort of lived experience of workers and using that to make decisions in terms of policy and practice. I'm wondering maybe if you could give us maybe an example. Might be really interesting to hear about how one of those sort of reflections or sort of observations from that kind of wider measurement piece has sort of informed or shaped perhaps a practice or a policy within Danske Bank.
So, I think people are dealing with a lot. We need to recognize that they've got a purpose outside work as well as within the workplace. And that purpose could be, for example, caring. So, one of the metrics that we got through the data gathering exercise is do they have caring responsibilities? And actually, 42% of our colleagues had caring responsibilities, and 52% were leaders of that population. So, unless we're really building systemically policies and support networks that will help them thrive, that will help them understand that there's an element of give and take, a large element of give and take in the organization, then we won't necessarily have tapped into what's really going to help them thrive and us thrive as well, right? So we have a number of caregiving policies in place. We've got 10 days carers leave. Obviously there's a structure and a process in place. You can't just get up and decide that today's a carers day. We really get underneath the skin of what is somebody dealing with outside, and it's not sometimes just primary caregiver to children. If we look at those aged between 40 and 49, most of our colleagues have got multiple caregiving, multi-generational caregiving performance. So the data from that drove our carers policy and drove us to really consider understanding why people weren't coming to work. So not capturing it as absence, capturing it as actually carers leave. And that really helped us understand how best to support colleagues, and therefore productivity and performance thereafter followed.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Connor, can I come to you? So your passion for values-driven leadership has encouraged you to launch Root and Rise, which sounds like a really fantastic, exciting initiative. So tell us about your venture and why you feel there's a need in today's business environment to explore some of those issues and needs.
Yeah, thanks, Juliet, and thanks to the business school for inviting me to be here today. So I suppose myself and my co-founder Jolie, we have led teams and people and organizations through lots of different sectors and across many years. And myself at the moment, I lead an occupational health company here in Northern Ireland. So your research piece is really, really interesting, and I think we see it in action every single day, especially in Northern Ireland as well. And it was really, I suppose, through our lived experience and our
professional experience or academic studies here in the MBA at Queen's, that we can see the impact that stress, burnout, disconnection, a lack of purpose can really have on people as individuals, teams as a whole, and then how that bleeds into an organization's performance. During the MBA, myself and Jolie found ourselves asking time and time again, well, what does sustainable leadership really look like? And one of the things we settled on was how a leader is able to show up in times of stress or complexity. We talked about SMEs, in your presentation, and they're the backbone of Northern Ireland. I work in an SME, and it can be stressful. You're doing everything all of the time. And really the question is, how can a leader, I suppose, show up in those times of stress or complexity to lead their team effectively? And we feel that to really do that, that leader needs to be balanced and well. And then that filters down into performance. When we were looking at all of this too, there were some statistics and facts that really, hit us hard or drive home the fact that this well-being challenge that we talk about really has a massive impact. Starting in Northern Ireland, 1 in 5 people will face a mental ill health challenge in their lifetime, and 20% of our workforce will go through that during their career. That at the moment, we look across the UK and we see long-term sickness absence sitting at over 3% at times. That's highly driven by conditions like stress, anxiety, and depression. And that's costing, as Juliet mentioned, employers upwards of 51 billion a year. And then globally, the World Health Organization tells us that there's $1 trillion a year lost in productivity due to those conditions and mental ill health at work. So why do I say those figures? I suppose it's the fact, in my opinion, that, this isn't wellness and well-being and organizational performance. It's not just an individual problem for each of us to tackle or for our teams, but I feel it's an economic and a societal problem. It's an issue that we can fix. And if we come together with solutions like the frameworks you've talked about, that we can really make a difference, and setting aside the moral argument for going, we need to look after, our fellow humans' health. There's a massive economic argument here. There's a lot of money being left on the table that if we come together with solutions, we can really fix that and see that return. So I suppose there is hope. In the UK alone, if an organisation for every £1 that they invest in a wellbeing initiative, they can expect up to £5 of a return from that, which is massive. But it really depends on what you're investing in. I think the days of giving the gym membership or another fruit bowl in the office, whilst are good and they serve a purpose, they really do, and they're not enough anymore. That's surface level. And our approach at Root and Rise really is to try and tackle those challenges that we talked about from the inside out. So we help leaders, organizations, and teams really understand the deeper patterns and behaviors that govern their daily decisions, how they show up in the world every day, and then how, I suppose, the impact that has on the organizations where they choose to work. And we do that through, blending sort of modern psychology, unconscious science, and leadership theory and practice, through workshops, seminars, retreats, those kind of vehicles to try and bring that self-awareness piece in, because we believe that if people are able to show up to work, especially leaders, and bring their best selves to work, to do that, they need to feel safe, they need to feel listened to, they need to feel that purpose, and they need to have a connection to what they're doing. And we believe that starts, I suppose, internally. So that's, I suppose, why we do what we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, I think, wonderful sort of overview in terms of the business imperative of mental health and well-being, and I love that sort of showing up. I'm wondering if you can sort of expand on that a little bit for us, if you've got any practical examples of where you've seen that with organizations or leaders that you've worked with. What does that look like and feel like, on a day-to-day basis or from a leadership practice perspective?
Well, one of the things that we've seen now, even as part of our MBA project, looked at this and we conducted primary research, but some of the things that we saw really, they can be boiled down to the impact that fear, definitions of success, managing our egos, can have, the impact that can have on how we move through our interactions with people every day as leaders. At an unconscious level, they're massive. the impact of that is huge, and the ripple effect that has in teams is very large. So I suppose encouraging an individual to develop that self-awareness and emotional intelligence to understand where the drivers of that potential fear or definition of success, or how their ego can take the driving seat sometimes, understanding where all of that comes from so that they can at least begin the work to unpack that and understand themselves more. That's a big thing. And I think we had interviews with 10 leaders during that, so it's a small study, yes, but that message came through time and time again. Once you unpack those items, you start to see yourself. You hold a bit of a mirror up to yourself, and you can see how your decisions and how you act actually filters right down to your team's performance, which is organizational performance at the end of the day.
Yeah, that interesting sort of unpacking of, who are you as a leader, what's important, what's that value structure, and how does that sort of drive your day-to-day behaviors, decisions, those kind of micro sort of leadership management moments. Brilliant. Thank you. Brendan, can I hand back over to you and to get your reflections on? So you've recently returned to CEO after a period of transition and market turbulence that's forced some tough decisions and a focused determination to reap new opportunities. What lessons have you learned about restoring balance between people and performance in times of uncertainty? And how are you applying those lessons in Kainos' current strategy?
Yeah, I mean, for context, for those who don't know, I returned at Christmas time. The company, after a long period of success, had a more challenging year last year, where we saw kind of our sales drop by 10% and profits down by 15%. And one of the outworkings of last year was that in March of this year, we took the decision to reduce our workforce by 7%. I think that, first of all, whenever you do a workforce reduction, for those of us who have done that, it's a very blunt tool. It causes significant damage across the culture in an organization, and it visits on those who are directly impacted a huge kind of stress as part of that. So we're always very aware of that, but there are some times whenever such a blunt tool is a required function of what you need to do. And for us, when we were kind of working through that process, it was kind of really important for us. We go back to kind of what are our values, how we think about supporting our colleagues who are impacted, both those directly and those who are staying on in the business as part of that. So you looked at those kind of values about respect, about creativity, about how you can help people find their next role, not inside Kainos, but somewhere else. But it is tough, and you do damage the culture, and that's important to kind of rebuild that afterwards. And a lot of that's about, as a leadership team, a leadership community, to be present, to deal with the issues that this kind of activity causes, to be honest about recognizing that impact and looking how you might address that for people who are staying inside the organization. I think that is about kind of, to me, communication. So it's about kind of constant communication, because the uncertainty that these kind of things create, both in the event itself, but also the aftermath as well. Is this the first of a series of reductions? Is my job safe? How can I think about, I'm the primary kind of breadwinner in the house. How do I make sure that my family is going to be cared for in this time of uncertainty? So it's just about kind of over communicating, often communicating the same message, often in the same way, so people kind of understand kind of the direction of travel. But it's a tricky thing to work through. I say I'm always conscious that as an organization it's tricky, but for those who are impacted, it is a much more complex thing to process, and your ability to support them does recede, because once they leave the organization, your ability to influence that, it becomes much more limited.
I'm curious from a leadership perspective, and one of the things I've heard a lot in my own research is where managers or leaders said, I find having some of those conversations really tough in terms of trying to find that balance in terms of honesty, transparency, but ultimately trying to keep some of those key tenets in terms of people-centered and empathetic and compassionate. And I'm wondering if you, in that sort of period of change and restructuring, does that sort of resonate? Has there been any sort of challenges in keeping those communication channels open and people-centered in what sounds like a fundamentally challenging period of time?
Um, I think so, Juliet. I mean, to me, when it comes to the communication, it being simple and open is just super important. If you look at our workforce, there's 3,000 people across the organization. We're in 20 different countries. For our workforce, 42% of our workforce, English is not their first language. So if you're looking to communicate a really important message, simply it has to be really simple for people to parse, because they're stressed by receiving these kind of things. So I think you have to just go back to what's the really simple message, not be about kind of why you're doing it from a business perspective, but also what you're going to do to support people through that process as well. But my encouragement is always to kind of step forward and be as transparent as you can. There will be some things you can't say, but generally that's maybe 5% of the message you have to convey.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that's really useful and interesting sort of point of reflection in terms of, keeping that communication simple, meaningful, but also it sounds like pairing that with an action. How are we here to help and support where we can?
And I think, we talk about communication, but a huge part of that is about listening. So, we do it ordinarily in a business, but during a period of stress, you have to absolutely, ask for feedback and for questions, and some of those will be very uncomfortable. But if you ask for that feedback, then you gotta recognize it, you gotta respond to it, you gotta explain what you're doing as a result of that. Because if you don't do anything with that feedback, then why will people give you feedback in the future?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Caroline, can I hand over to you? So Danske Bank recently introduced enhanced support measures for colleagues experiencing menopause, so including 10 days of additional leave. How do you see these kinds of policies contributing to a more balanced and human-centric approach in terms of performance and well-being?
Yeah, it was one of the policies that came through some of our colleagues' stories. I was out in a branch, and there was one of our ladies in one of our branches out in the country was really struggling, and with some really well-intentioned properties teams in every organisation, I guess, but bringing in things like fans and things that would help that particular individual's experience and work was becoming an unnecessary battle. So, I think this is about connecting visits, connecting our employee stories with meaningful outcomes and actions as well. So we really started to think about menopause and the fact that that doesn't just affect our female colleagues, it affects families, it affects line managers, it affects the whole ecosystem around what makes success in a workplace. So we did a lot of work. We published our manifesto, which really set out the commitments that we've got to everybody that's impacted, not just the lady in question. We really crowdsourced a lot of the experience and examples with our managers. What our male managers find really difficult. It's one of those taboo subjects. It's really difficult to broach, but it does affect performance in the workplace. It can affect mental health and well-being. And I think we took some courageous decisions, and some of our male leaders were amazing allies who openly spoke, sponsored, led, fronted up some of these discussions in the workplace. Again, a bit to Brendan's point, some of those difficult conversations. When you ask a question, you need to make sure that you're capable and able to provide an answer and a solution, and to create a further level of transparency in the organisation as well. So that really kind of led us to the policy, recognising again that people need support at different life stages.
It's really interesting that you sort of highlight some of as a topic here in terms of menopause, being taboo. I suspect there's still sort of perhaps some areas in terms of stigma still residual in that. How, as an organization or a leadership team, did you navigate some of that sort of space in terms of opening the conversation around menopause, exploring that through sort of policy and practice terms? I mean, was that challenging? Was it fairly straightforward? What were some challenges and experiences with that process?
I think one of the challenges was it's a female problem, and it's not. It's an organisational opportunity just to understand more about our colleagues. I think navigating some of those changes, we've got a fairly evolved EDI infrastructure in terms of our employee resource groups, our gender diversity network really led the way in this. And it's not a women's network, it's a gender diversity, recognizing that there's different challenges in the workplace that both genders or all genders in a more broad context experience. And many of them stepped up to support, because allyship is a really important part, intersectionality is a really important part of our EDI strategy to understand not just a very linear or pillared approach, but actually it's about the world experience, it's about what that individual's lived experience is like, managing people who are perhaps been through menopause, living with people who are perhaps going through menopause, and also being that individual as well. So we solved a lot of the problems through really deeply delving into our concept of allyship and intersectionality, and pulling some real heroes forward. Some of those individuals who got known for being real champions, and that really helped their leadership capability as well and stepping up.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a wonderful example, as I would see it, in terms of such a holistic, comprehensive approach. So really exploring and considering that issue. It feels a little bit like from a 360 perspective. So not just from one, employee's perspective, but actually thinking of it as a wider experience that sort of interfaces across the organization. Brilliant. Connor, can I follow up with you? So as you're currently as an MBA candidate, soon to graduate, which is exciting, you may have a closer connection to the Gen Z uh, generation than than I know than the rest of us here on stage. But I think it picks up actually on one of the interesting sort of wider comments of talking about intergenerational challenges and different views and emerging considerations of what different generations want from organizations, they want from working life. So how do you feel the current generation are influencing the sort of leadership pendulum, and how can organizations best embrace this generation to help drive performance?
I have to say, when I read this question first and thought about creating my answer, I thought, you know what, I might have to break out the Just for Men here and shave my beard to roll back a few years so I can answer this properly. But all jokes aside, I think actually what Gen Z, we'll call them Gen Z, really bring to the table is they hold up a mirror, to previous generations and ask, why do we do things the way we do it? Why do you lead the way you lead? And I think that's a really good thing. That's a good question to ask. I also think as well that generation is very clear on what they want out of the employer-employee deal. And they're not afraid to say that, listen, we put purpose and we put meaning and we put well-being front and center in that deal. That's not a secondary thing. This needs to be a primary thing. I think as leaders, we're always learning, hopefully. And we are influenced. I'll put myself in the millennial generation. We learn from generations gone past, have gone past us, and the systems of work there and how decisions were made or whatever. And we bring our own unique take on that. We take those lessons and we put our own unique spin on it. And I think with the talk about Gen Z is that there's an invitation for us all to be a wee bit more open. Because what I actually think that generation is doing is moving things forward from a question perspective of why we do things, more than other generations have. I feel like that generation is bringing a perspective that we haven't been used to hearing for a while, and that's the importance of purpose and well-being in what we do, and it shouldn't be secondary. I think that we need to be, we can teach that generation an awful lot. When it comes to, I feel, like resilience, things like resilience and accountability, I think are big lessons that we can share. But, there's just as many lessons that we can receive in return. And that's on the importance of those topics that I just said. But I think the big challenge is for us, I suppose, as any generation that sits behind that, is to encourage that energy to come through in your organization and to, be open and patient to that. I always think of the old sayings, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, listen more. And it's about, I suppose, being patient with taking that, understanding their perspective or their thoughts or their opinions on things, and really trying to pass down knowledge, lessons, in the hope that they can distill or take more from that even that we did, and bring their own energy to it. And I think just in an organization, that generation really wants to be heard, and they want their opinions at least factored into the debate, about how to lead an organization forward. There was something I read the other day that said a lot of Gen Z are struggling to get into positions of management or leadership, but by choice, there's less and less wanting to enter that. And I think that's because they see the cost associated with that as too great at the minute. And I think they're wanting to redefine the game. I think they look at their parents or leaders in the organization or role models and think, you know what, that costs too much for me right now. The balance isn't right. And I think that's the value that they can bring to organizations going forward if we're willing to listen.
It's a really interesting reflection, and I'm just sort of reflecting on both those really important insights in terms of opening up the conversation and listening to those reflections, hearing those reflections, and really bringing those to the table to sort of ask some, sounds like pretty profound and important questions about who are we as an organization, who am I as a leader, and how do we start to evolve in that space. Um, do you have any reflections on how do you go about doing that? How do you open up that conversation um, broadly within that generation? But maybe there's also something in terms of intergenerationally. I mean, as you were saying, there's important learnings across that sort of journey and spectrum. And how do we go about opening that up to hear, to listen, and to respond?
Yeah, I think that comes from a culture piece in an organization, and that needs to come from leadership in terms of, um, I think, getting more tangible terms, a bit of training, on your unconscious bias, your opinions, don't need to be front and center all of the time. There are various different leadership techniques and management techniques you can use here, like your thinking hats and all of those things that we know very well. But if that's not underpinned by a desire, to use them in a way that brings out the most opinions as possible, to consider them, then that's a problem. Um, I think as well, probably, making, making, given different generations that you talked about psychological safety, that feeling of safety is in, I can share and I'm not going to be judged. My opinion is going to be considered. My thoughts are going to be considered, but they're not necessarily going to be judged as good or bad, that they're all valid, and then having the tools, I suppose, as leaders to sift through that information and see that information and look for the golden nuggets because they're always there. But I think what we can do is naturally as humans, we make judgments on things, we make judgments on opinions and on people, and those can inform our willingness to listen to those conversations. But there's lots of things an organization can do to kind of promote that, and I don't think it needs to be that complicated. Just open forums around certain topics, bring a degree of structure to how you seek those opinions as well, and maybe apply a bit of a communication framework to that, and then I think you have to walk the talk. Then you have to show that we have listened to what you've said and we have taken it on board. And I think the best way to do that is to integrate some of those opinions into the success stories, and show, listen, the writing's on the wall here. You were right. You added to this. This, we appreciate it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's that reflection's so interesting. And I think it to me, it sort of sounds actually across all the panel members feels like a real sort of nugget of sort of truth in terms of that importance of hearing, listening, and responding. Dare I say closing the loop on soliciting that feedback, encouraging it, creating the environment and the conditions for that to be expressed, but also as an organization to really meaningfully hear that and consider where response can happen, great, and where not, maybe trying to make sure that those communication channels are there to help navigate and understands that in a kind of transparent way. I know we're just on 10 o'clock, so perhaps a fantastic opportunity to welcome and invite questions from the audience. Now, there is a mic that will be floating around, so brilliant. Yes, please. We'll just get the mic to you so everyone can hear you.
Thank you very much. This has been a fabulous session, so thanks, Queens, for organising. My question is to Brendan, and it's a two-part question, Brendan, if you don't mind. One is, in your return to Kainos, has it changed your leadership style in any way? And the second part of it is, particularly given the topic that we're discussing, have you experience of a very high performer, particularly in a profit-generating organisation, but that was not value-aligned, and how you dealt with that?
So I have a couple of colleagues in the audience. You know, and actually, I've forgotten the first part of the question, so I'm really sorry. You could.
Just about change your leadership style in any way.
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to offer an opinion on. I think that your leadership. Oh, sorry, my observation of my leadership style is that you change it based on the circumstance. So I think that when things are going well, your leadership style is probably to be very much in the background, making sure that things are working and supporting colleagues around that. Where you're in more of a I guess if you use the word crisis, then I think you need to be more directional around what needs to happen. So I would say that this year has been much more about giving clear direction about what we should be trying to achieve, as opposed to soliciting lots of discussion and arriving at consensus. I'm looking at my two colleagues; they're both nodding. So that, and then the second part about someone who is a strong performer but is not culturally aligned. So I know you used the word we're in a profit-focused organization. I think any organization, be it a team in sport the whole way through to any kind of organization in public or private sector, if someone's not aligned to your values, then you need to deal with that. And the best way is to get a person to change their behaviors to align with the organization. But if that's not something that they feel they can do, then I think the conversation is about how they build their career somewhere else. Yeah.
Brilliant. We've got another question there. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Tanvi Maska. I'm an MBA student. So my question is for all three. How to maintain, like according to the new leadership paradigm, how to maintain a collaborative environment in an organization, like how to have a particular mindset, and is it important to have a flat hierarchy structure to improve the communication?
I'll go first then. So I suppose it really starts with how do you define success and how do you measure success? Do you actually measure collaboration? As part of our engagement approach, we actually ask if you how do you rate collaboration between teams in the organization? How do you rate collaboration in the team that you're working in? And that really helps us diagnose where in the organization it's working really well and where perhaps it's not. I think it's been really challenging since hybrid working coming in has made that collaboration and connection much more challenging. But I think our response to that has been to be really thoughtful and to probably prescribe and be more directional than we would have been before in how we're expecting people to work, getting leaders to go out and connect in with teams that they haven't worked in before to understand where's the opportunities for collaboration, how can they get to know more about each other, how do we do that in a face-to-face versus a virtual situation. We still have 60% of our colleagues working 40% of their time in a hybrid way. So I think it's on one accepting that every organization has got a challenge there. I don't know one that from a collaboration perspective is perfection. And the second piece is understanding where it's working well and where it's working not, and measuring that. And the final piece is putting in systems, processes, structures, ways of working to enable those conversations to at least be triggered, and for that to be then recognized around your values and how you reward people.
Just to add to that, I agree with that completely. On I suppose more of a micro approach, when you're looking at things like projects or very specific team-based, collaboration-based activities, that you can take a bit of a risk approach to it from the get-go when you're designing these. So how risky is it for this project to go wrong or to take longer or to face complications due to interpersonal issues or with certain members of a team who are going through an upskilling journey? So I think you can take a bit of a risk approach and say, listen, this is a very high risk project for us, so we need our aces in places here. There is no room for somebody coming on a bit of a learning journey with this. This is very high priority. But there are lots of business projects where you can say, these are our people. These are the people who need to develop or who could develop from this. These are people who would very, very much work well together, but it may take a little longer to get there. And take a technical approach to it, and assess team activities before you actually just throw people together, and hope for the best. That would be my only addition to that.
Brilliant. We've got a question just at the back. Brilliant. Thank you.
Hey, so I think the panel is quite diverse for technology and then finance and then, of course, consulting. So it's a question for all of you, but probably a three-part. So one of those discussions that we have is for corporate health, right? So I would like to ask that how do we measure the safety strategy that we have in compliance metrics? And then I would say, what are the KPIs that you actually have for employees and your leadership to actually measure those actions are being taken and how they are being incorporated within the employees?
Okay, I mean, it's quite complex to measure psychological safety inside an organization. I mean, the tool we use most often is it's a tool called Peakon, so it measures employee engagement. So every month we will ask between 6 and 8 questions of the entire organization. And ask, that could be anything from how they feel they're rewarded for the work they do through to how safe they feel in the workplace. And that information, because every workplace is not just about psychological safety, it's about a whole bunch of different factors, then that really forms our thought process about what we do over the next 3 months in terms of dealing with any issues that are raised to that and recognizing that sometimes we make progress on other areas as well. And I think a big part of that asking for feedbacks, we measure participation rates, not just on a individual survey, but over the course of the year, how many of our colleagues are choosing not to participate in those surveys. So while they're anonymous, we do know those participation rates. But it's really important then to say this, share with the company, this is what we've been told by all of you. So there's, 2,000 people have responded. Here are the key themes around that. And then to lay out quite clearly our plans around addressing areas where we can improve. So it's back to the idea about asking for feedback, listening to that feedback, forming your plans based on that feedback, and sharing that plan with the organization.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one because, if you're trying to understand psychological safety, you ask ask people if they feel psychologically safe in work. And those that feel they are psychologically safe will say yes, they do. And those that feel that they aren't psychologically safe will say yes, they do. And that's part of the conundrum. I think having a balanced culture dashboard, having a look at not just your engagement and your participation, but aspects such as whistleblowing. So how many people are coming through a whistleblowing line, for example, that feel they can't have those open conversations is one way. Having a look at the rationale and the reasons for absence, having a look at other ways you can really understand what's going on. Leaver data and understanding how many people would actually come back, why they're leaving in the first place, because of very little axe to grind once they leave the organisation, and not asking them immediately, ask them 6 months later, I think has been some of the ways that we've really understood what's going on. And every organisation has got probably problematic departments. They've got line managers that you can't quite put your finger on it, and you really need to try and diagnose what is going on. Especially where you've got geographical dispersal and you've got a head office somewhere, it's really, really challenging. So I think you need to look more broadly than just the normal metrics that would come through, and then pull that together in a culture framework and a culture dashboard.
Okay.
Yeah, focusing on a number is very hard because that number can fluctuate so much. And what is on a scale of 1 to 10, what does 6 represent? What does 8 represent? What's the big difference there? I think probably encouraging people to put how they feel more in writing or in speaking to you, and then deriving themes from that over periods of time. A bad week can have a big impact on us, more so potentially than a great month, or a great 2 months. It only takes a small challenging period to really impact on how we may report how we feel.
Right.
And so I think taking a long time scale approach and looking for trends across time through themes that appear time and time again in conversations would be the only other thing that I might add to that.
Thanks very much.
Brilliant. I might also just highlight we've got, if there's interest, our first value in the support framework, the safety one. We've got a workbook in our kind of infographic that goes to the training. Might be interesting to have a look at that and some of the kind of guiding principles, which I think really pick up really lovely in terms of what the panel, their observations and sort of experience, and that might be interesting to have a look through.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Yes, please.
It's
question for you around the sort of generational silos and how useful or not it is to sort of put people into those boxes. I suppose particularly in the where we all are from, is there a potential that creates the them's and us's sort of approach to it and gives us all a reason, because I just don't understand what that generation's about, rather than just accepting that younger people have always thought differently than older people. And it's just about creating that culture of listening and empathy and just how important do you think those silos are in getting in creating that culture of, I suppose, of accountability and empathy and understanding?
I think not very. I think you've hit the nail on the head. That's, there's always been a divide as long as time's been around. I think those that are entering the workplace now get a really bad rap, and they're a lot more resilient than we think. They've been through COVID. They've had to work in a hybrid way. They've had to be taught very differently during the course of the recent years. If I look at our apprentice program, so we have around about 100 higher level apprentices in the business now, and what they contribute, the resilience that they show, the stories that they tell, and the way that they lead, they're much more likely to be leaders in our fields of diversity. They're much more likely to have lifelong learning because they've been brought in and they're actually studying and earning at the same time. And I think that, I think it's very unfortunate we have a lot of the stereotypical language across. I think when we look at, however, some of the solutions, there is very different challenges that people face joining the workforce, becoming parents, for example, being older workers in the workforce. And I think where we can have uniting policies, it takes a village to raise people, and infrastructure in Northern Ireland isn't particularly helpful to that. When you think about childcare and the cost of living, it's really, really hard. So we've looked very much at policies. We've got a grandparents' leave policy, and that very much was born out of the fact that, look, we know our older grandparents are dying to spend time with younger children as the generations move through. Let's have a policy that actually supports that celebrates the role that families and connection plays in the workplace. And let's be realistic, when something happens and somebody's ill or a grandchild is ill, that person is going to cover it whatever it takes. So you may as well have a policy that sort of is culturally aligned to what you're saying about a supportive, empathetic, culture, which is leading excellence through empathy.
I think the silos come from our human nature of wanting to have some sort of order, and some sort of definition on things, and we don't like it when we don't have that. So I think it's an attempt to order your thinking, but I agree that it's unhelpful because it takes away from the individuality of people. It puts you in a box, and that's not a positive thing. I suppose it's a tool to try and maybe potentially organize some thinking around it, and I think that's where it comes from. But I would agree with you that it's unhelpful to continue down that path as you design policies. Your policies need to be on what your people need rather than what specific generations you think they might need. I agree.
Brilliant. Time? No?
Are we any more pressing questions? Nope. Great. Folks, it is an absolute privilege to welcome you all this morning again. I think it's been a really insightful event, and I would just like to take an opportunity to reflect a little bit in terms of expressing our thanks. Juliet very much represented the academic powerhouse that is behind Queen's Business School. We've very, very recently had our triple accreditation stamped within the school, which on a global scale within higher education puts us in a 1% bracket in terms of business schools across the world. So we're immensely proud of that, but we're more proud of the work that goes on behind the scenes to make that happen. And I think Juliet Hassard very much reflected some of that work in terms of our research. We have a mission really to educate and explore for the benefit of business and society. And I think Juliet's research is very much an indication that we're doing well in that field. So if I could just ask you to extend a round of applause for Juliet, sort of it. Thanks. And obviously a big part of our success, and I suppose our driving force in terms of moving forward as a business school is developing principled and effective leaders in terms of the studentship, both at undergraduate, postgraduate, and also at executive education level. But I think on stage today, we really have a representation of best in class in terms of principled and effective leaders. Brendan Mooney is probably on a personal level a hero of mine, I suppose, in terms of business senses. He is one of our most, very arguably, most successful CEOs on the island of Ireland, and the Kainos business spans across, as he had said, sort of across the world. So I'm really pleased that Brendan gave up some of his time this morning to join us. I'll move on to Caroline as well. I think Caroline is again, sort of from someone who's worked in recruitment and the people and talent industry. Caroline is very much a world-class leader in that sphere. She is also a really good representation of someone who has left the island and come back as one of our returning talents, and has come back to enrich, I think, not only Danske Bank, but sort of the overall sort of business economy here in Northern Ireland. So Caroline van de Feltz, thank you. And also then, last but not least, Connor O'Rourke. Connor, as he had said, is one of our MBA students who's due to finish this year, and I think very eloquently represented himself, the Root and Rise organisation, but also kind of the MBA cohort, of which I'm proud to be part of as well. I'm a year behind Connor, so I'm just hoping that I get some of his notes today. That's a real mission for inviting him along. But folks, at the business school here, we do depend largely on the engagement with the business community across many different facets. Obviously, my team's very involved in placements and internships and embedding our talent during the student journey into your organisations. That's a big part of it. You've heard about Juliet's research today, so there's very much an opportunity for you and your organisations to be involved in some of that research piece as well. And then obviously the executive education piece. I think we're living in an era now where lifelong learning is not a luxury but a necessity. So we're really pleased with what we have on offer here in terms of that lifelong opportunities. So would ask you just please extend the conversation where you can. We're very much an open door policy within the Queen's Business School campus here, and we're always welcoming new opportunities to collaborate. So if I can just ask you to round it off, and feel free to hang around for a chat with any of the panel here, but if I can ask you just to say a special thanks to the panel today for their contributions. And so